So far in the presentation today, we've seen how in the Design Robotics project, we're expanding the sensing capabilities and smarts of manufacturing robots, and we're exploring new ways of using robots in advanced manufacturing processes. We think of this as creating new robotic tools for advanced manufacturing. You might also be wondering by now, how do we make sure that these robotic manufacturing technologies and processes are useful tools for the people that will use them in their work? How do you design a robot that's useful for people? We've got three speakers who are going to help us answer this question. First, we need to design for the real world of the shop floor, not the idealized world of the research lab. Dr. Claire Brophy will show some of the clever and surprising ways people use to get their work done. This lets us design robotic systems that better integrate with human ways of working. Second, we need to design for robots to be more collaborative and start working alongside people. Associate Professor Marcus Rittenbrook will discuss how researchers are starting to think about humans and robots as collaborative partners, where people do the parts of a job that people are good at, like improvisation and creativity, and robots do the parts of a job that they're well suited for, like repetition and working in hazardous environments. Thirdly, we need to get the people who will use the robots we design involved in telling us what they should look like. Get them involved in the design process, even if they're not expert robotics researchers. Valeria Macalupu will show us how she's been using design methods to help people have a say in what robots should look like and do as we start to use them in the context of our homes. Valeria's work shows that you definitely don't need to be an expert in order to have strong opinions and great ideas about what a robot should do. So I'm going to hand over to Claire and she'll start the first part of the presentation.
We're really grateful for your company today. I hope you've been enjoying the presentation of our work. I'm going to change gears a little bit here. As Jared has talked about, we've talked a lot about the technical capabilities and what is technically feasible, but technical feasibility alone is not enough to sustain these innovations. I'm interested in the people, in the social systems. I'm not going to tell you anything new today, nothing that we can't learn from how automation was successful in the automotive industry in the 1980s. And it was about the people and the human systems and designing systems to support meaningful work and understanding context. So if robotics are to step out of the lab and into the real world context, then we need to understand the details of that work, and we need to understand the details of real world practices. And we need to design these systems so that they support these real world practices and support people to conduct meaningful work and achieve quality in their work. And all the information we need to do this is available to us. It's just about looking and listening for those details. But the reality is we rarely talk about what we do in the work that we're doing. Have you ever been in a position where you've had to train someone to do a job that you've been doing automatically? It's really difficult. Here, I'm going to call this person M. They're an expert craftsman, and they're sitting with our research team to talk about how they polish or linish this curved metal surface. So they're not just talking about the technical process of how to do this job, but like Peter was talking about earlier, they're talking about what they see and feel when they're doing this job. They're talking about how they use the light and the reflections of the light off of the surface to understand the color and texture and finish, and to see the lines and the dents and the spaces in between all of those parts of the surface. And they use that information to decide what happens next in the process, what sandpaper to choose, how many passes they might need to do to complete this work successfully. And there's evidence of this kind of work all through the factory. There's evidence of this human intervention, of these processes, of this knowledge, of this labeling, communication, and data. This, what you're seeing here, are massive big blocks of foam that have been ordered in to complete a job on the robot. And they've been labeled by the cut parts of the file that are going to head to the robot. How might we support a system of that kind of labeling, that kind of documentation and communication? And what about the cleaning and maintenance, servicing and troubleshooting? What happens with all this mess? Who cleans that up? And what are the processes that we need to build around that? And whose tool is it? And because we're working in the real world with real world materials, what happens when those tools wear out? What is the system for that? And how might we design for working on the fly, for problem solving and little bespoke tools that help the experts complete those jobs successfully into a high level of quality? And what about problem solving on the fly? How might robots help the experts decide what went wrong and where it went wrong in that process? This sort of problem discovery and solutions on the fly. And how might it provide information so that people don't make those mistakes again and that the system improves along the way? So I might just leave you with a thought that somebody proposed to me just recently, and it was about advanced robotics and the challenges of advanced manufacturing and robotics. And they asked me if it was about redesigning the process or about how the process redesign is conducted. And with that, I'll leave you and I'll pass over to Associate Professor Marcus Rittenbrook to carry on our conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Claire. My name is Marcus Rittenbrook. I'm the Associate Director of the QT Design Lab. And I'm going to follow on from Claire's presentation and talk a little bit about human-robot collaboration and what it actually means in the context of manufacturing. Sorry, just give me a sec. There we go. So this is a typical setup for a complex robotic system that we might see a place like a car manufacturer. So there's a number of highly tuned commercial robotic arms that conduct a series of steps and processes. And as you can see, that's actually a caged area. So that's not something where a human would sort of easily step in, and that's for good reason, because it's a very dangerous environment. So this notion of human-robot collaboration is something that sort of doesn't really apply to a setup like that. So the question is, as Jared pointed out earlier, if we want to use human capabilities, so things like creativity, things that can't easily be replicated by robots, how do we actually bring the human in the loop? How do we get the human into a system and allow human and robots to work together? So that's the question that we have. So if we look at systems like collaborative robotics and robotics arms, so that's something that's been introduced earlier. You get a much smaller arm that is much safer. So it's much less likely to kill somebody. They're force limited. They also have a much lower payload. So in this example here, you can see two people on their workstations, and one advantage is that arm can actually service multiple people in multiple workstations. So that's a really good starting point from a technological perspective, that we have sort of these systems to work with. But it doesn't solve our problems necessarily, because we still need to understand the context and how people work and how people collaborate. So the first step in this notion of human-robot collaboration is really to think about the collaborative processes, the real-world processes, and how we translate that into a setup that involves a robot in addition to humans, and helps people to use robots effectively as tools. So these are things like understanding context, like Claire pointed out, but also very much to understand collaboration. And collaboration isn't something that's simple. So we often find in routines that are not automated, we find collaboration is very flexible and very customized. Humans are very good to responding to to incidents. And that's something that we want very much want to support. But how do we do that in a human-robot collaboration setup? So that's one of the questions that we have. And then human-robot collaboration is also something that doesn't just apply to a system where you have a smaller cobot. It might also involve large robotic arms. And that obviously brings questions around safety, first and foremost. And so those are very different setups, and we have to consider the requirements for these. So safety is something that's, I think, being considered quite a bit in the context of robotic systems. There's some safety norms that are specifically designed for cobotic systems. For instance, these norms here. So there are things like safety-rated monitoring stop. So that's all about basically making sure that the human and robot are never in the same, operating at the same time in the same place. So you use things like light curtains to basically stop a human entering the workspace or stop the robot, or things like cages. Another common approach is hand guiding, where the human actually guides the robot and uses a hand guiding device. And then there are forms of monitoring and of limiting. So the first one is speed and separation monitoring. So that's looking at to make sure that the robot has an appropriate speed. If a human is in the workplace, the robot gets a lot slower so that injury is much less likely. And force limiting similarly limits the force. That's often when a human sort of touches the robot and there's some interaction. So there's a force threshold that can be determined. So these things are in place, and that's great. But there are many questions that are still open about human-robot collaboration that go beyond safety. So if we're really looking at how do we get people to work efficiently with robots. And I'm just going to pose 3 questions here that we are asking in a training center on collaborative robotics that we have established. And those are questions specifically around the interfacing, the human-robot interaction, and how we can improve that interface between human and robots. The first one is human-robotic intention visualization. So that's very much about the notion that sort of for humans to understand the robotic process, where the robot is moving, what the robot is planning to do. So that's basically keeping the human in the loop, because that process isn't always easy to understand. You might have a robot moving, and if there's dynamic path planning, for instance, there's actually no indication whether the robot might change the path or grab a different tool, etc. So these are things that where we actually want to use things like projection technology, augmented reality, ambient displays to show the human what the robot's intentions are. So that's one question. Another question is around the use of multimodal interfaces in human-robot collaboration. So can we use gestural interfaces, haptic and sound-based interfaces? Those are things that I think are particularly relevant for things like handover routines, where humans work very closely and actually touch the robot, hand over work pieces, etc. So haptic and other sort of feedback can really be helpful for humans to understand when it's the right moment to grab a tool, for instance. And then more broadly, the last question that we're trying to answer is more around the question, how do we actually prototype on this? So in design-based processes, we often sort of prototype and iterate before we find a solution that is suitable. And how do we do that in an environment where the robots are potentially dangerous? So the idea here is to develop a prototyping environment where we can simulate robotic processes, where we can to test new tasks and processes to allow us to arrive at a solution that is suitable for a particular context. So to sum up, the research on human-robot collaboration goes beyond the notion of robotics and looks at how we integrate human and robotic capacities. Thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Valeria Macalupo next.
Hi everyone, I hope you're having a good day today. My name is Valeria Macalupo. I am a PhD candidate from the School of Design at QUT, and I'm going to talk about human-centered design for social robotics. To do this, I'll use my research thesis as an example. The title is Supporting Effective Connections Between Elders Through Socially Interactive Robots, a Design Framework. This basically means that I'm using human-centered design through a participatory design approach and using co-design methods to really understand the concerns and experiences and worries that elders have when using social robotics, especially to know that we are making the right thing by using social robots instead of just making a robot right. And the contribution to the human-robot interaction field and the interaction design is design requirements for a long-term integration of these social robots in the elders' everyday life. I want to highlight the importance of human-centered design here because we're doing technology for elders, but also with these elders. I want to show you a couple of examples of social robots because the importance here is that behind every robot, there are important insights based on users and real people. So for example, behind the greeting machine, an abstract robotic object that for opening encounters, behind this robot, there are people that weren't great about the understanding of a humanoid robot when encountering it. They were feeling great about it. And behind the animal therapy with elders with dementia, there were elders that were distressed in nursing homes because of a lack of human contact. Now, the expectation for my first study was to have a physical co-design workshop with elders to really discover and understand their everyday life, context, and preconceived ideas that they have about robots and social robots. But COVID-19 happened, and so what the reality was that we had to change it to an online design activities. For this, I thought, how can we mitigate the social interaction and social connections that we didn't have at hand now because of social distancing, while using current platforms and tools that they had in their hands? Well, for this, I did two things. First, instructional videos. So what I did was film myself doing instructional videos about what social robots are as an introduction of the theme, and as well the design activities that I was asking them to do. And I filmed myself doing the activities, explaining to them, so as to simulate that the researcher is doing the activities with the participants, but at their own time. There might have been a lack of discussion that was proposed at first in the co-design workshop with other elders, but at least this way, they didn't feel alone doing it and clueless. And secondly, the data collection was in collaborative activities through PowerPoint. So after the design activities, an interview through Zoom or Skype was followed, where we would look at what they have done and the materials they have sent to me, and then we'll discuss and talk about it. And also discussing the ideas about what social robots are, more examples, and what were their needs and requirements related to this. In this sense, the human-centered design makes social robots accessible to everyone, especially these users. And they put an end user, like an older adult, as an active participant throughout the whole research and design process. And finally, I just want to let you with this amazing quote that I found from IDEO. A memorable human story is the groundwork to purposeful design. So please engage your users in the research and design process. I'd like now to hand over to Associate Professor Glenda Amayo Caldwell, Chief Investigator and Chair to the next session, Open Innovation.